When Emily Carter booked a 5-day vacation to Ashmore Cove, she packed light. A week's worth of clothes, a pair of hiking boots, 3 mystery novels she'd been meaning to read for months, a weathered travel notebook she'd carried on every trip since she was 23, and her camera. Photography wasn't Emily's profession. It was simply how she remembered places. While most people brought home souvenirs, Emily brought home photographs. Hundreds of them. She once told her younger sister that photographs captured places the way memory never could. People forget details, she said. Cameras don't. Friends described her as curious. The kind of person who would take the long way back to a hotel simply because she'd spotted an old bookstore or an interesting side street. She traveled alone often. Not because she disliked company, but because she believed being alone forced you to notice the world more carefully. It was a philosophy she'd written inside every one of her travel notebooks. You notice more when you're alone. On Monday morning, Emily left Boston expecting to spend 5 peaceful days along the Maine coast. She never returned home. 6 years later, investigators still cannot explain what happened after she checked into a quiet oceanside cottage overlooking the Atlantic. No signs of violence. No ransom demand. No financial activity and no body. Just a trail of evidence that seemed to point in every direction. And nowhere at all. This is the story of Emily Carter. A woman who arrived in Ashmore Cove looking for silence, and disappeared into one of the town's greatest unsolved mysteries. Ashmore Cove wasn't the kind of place people accidentally discovered. The small coastal town sat several hours from the nearest city, tucked between dense pine forests and the Atlantic Ocean. Life moved slowly there. Fishing boats left the harbor before sunrise. Locals greeted one another by name. Tourists arrived for quiet beaches, fresh seafood, and spectacular views rather than nightlife or luxury resorts. Emily had found the town the same way many visitors did. A photograph. Months earlier, while scrolling through a travel blog, she'd come across an image of an old lighthouse standing against dark cliffs as waves crashed below. The caption beneath it was simple: Ashmore Cove at sunrise. Within an hour, she'd booked the trip. According to her sister, Emily had been looking forward to it for weeks. Work had become exhausting. She'd recently been shortlisted for a promotion that everyone expected her to celebrate. Instead, she requested vacation time. When a coworker asked why she'd leave just before the biggest opportunity of her career, Emily smiled. If I don't slow down now, I'll forget why I'm working so hard in the first place. Those would become some of the last words anyone at work remembered her saying. Emily arrived just after 1 o'clock that afternoon. Security cameras outside Seabrook Cottages captured her pulling into the gravel parking lot in a silver rental car. She stepped out wearing sunglasses, jeans, and a navy blue windbreaker. She looked exactly like countless other tourists who visited Ashmore Cove every summer. Relaxed, unhurried, completely unaware that investigators would one day study these ordinary moments frame by frame. The receptionist who checked her in later described Emily as impossibly polite. She asked about local restaurants, the best sunrise viewpoints, and whether the lighthouse trail was worth visiting. The receptionist laughed and said, "If you've got a camera, go before sunrise, it's the best view in town." Emily smiled. "I'll be there." Those words would later take on a significance no one could have imagined. Cottage 7 sat at the edge of the property, separated from the others by a narrow stretch of dune grass overlooking the water. It wasn't luxurious. That was exactly why Emily had chosen it. It had a single bedroom and a small kitchen with a wooden porch facing the ocean. Inside, she unpacked only the essentials. She placed her camera on the bedside table, hung her jacket beside the door, then opened the first page of her travel notebook. As always, she wrote a single sentence. "What do I hope to remember about this place?" She left the answer blank. Emily believed every destination should answer that question for itself. She closed the notebook, picked up her camera, and spent the afternoon exploring the town. Over the next several hours, she became a familiar face around Ashmore Cove. A cashier at the grocery store remembered helping her choose local coffee. A bookstore owner recalled recommending 2 novels by Maine authors after noticing the stack she carried. She spent nearly 20 minutes talking with an elderly artist selling watercolor paintings near the harbor. She admired a watercolor painting of the waves not because she intended to buy it, because she wanted to know how long he'd lived there. 48 years, he told her. Emily replied with the same sentence she often wrote beneath her photographs. "That must mean you've seen things tourists never will." The old man smiled. "I've seen enough to know the ocean keeps its secrets." At the time, it sounded like nothing more than a poetic remark from an old fisherman. Months later, investigators would read it very differently. That evening, Emily had dinner at Harbor Lights restaurant overlooking the marina. Several employees remembered her for one simple reason. She was easy to talk to. When the waitress apologized because her slice of blackberry pie was larger than usual, Emily laughed. "There's no need for an apology. That's excellent customer service." The waitress laughed with her. It was a tiny exchange, one of hundreds that happen every day in restaurants across the country. But after Emily disappeared, it became one of the last confirmed moments anyone remembered her smiling. She paid her bill at 8:23 p.m. Security footage showed her leaving the restaurant a minute later. She paused outside to photograph the harbor glowing beneath the setting sun. Then she climbed into her rental car. What investigators didn't know at the time was that someone else was already watching her, standing across the street, partially hidden beneath the awning of a closed bookstore. Too far away for anyone to notice, too distant for security cameras to identify. The figure remained motionless until Emily drove away. Then, they disappeared into the night. Emily returned to Seabrook Cottages just after 9:15 p.m. The security camera overlooking the entrance recorded her rental car rolling slowly across the gravel driveway before turning toward Cottage 7. She parked in the same space she'd used that afternoon. The headlights disappeared for a few moments, then the driver's door opened. Emily stepped out carrying a small paper bag from the grocery store and her camera slung over one shoulder. She paused before walking inside. Not because she'd heard anything, not because she'd seen anyone. She simply stood on the porch for a few seconds, listening to the waves breaking against the shoreline below. Ashmore Cove was remarkably quiet after dark. There were no passing trains, no distant traffic, only the wind moving through the dune grass and the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic. It was exactly the kind of silence Emily had come looking for. She unlocked the door and disappeared inside. It would be the last time anyone could say with certainty where she was. At 9:34 p.m., Emily took what investigators would later believe was the final photograph recovered from her trip. She stood on the porch of Cottage 7 and aimed her camera toward the shoreline. At first glance, the image looked unremarkable. Moonlight reflected across the water. Dark waves curled around a cluster of jagged rocks. The lighthouse stood in the distance, its beams sweeping slowly across the sea. It wasn't until detectives enlarged the photograph several days later that they noticed something they hadn't seen before. Near the water's edge, someone appeared to be standing on the rocks. The figure was barely visible, just a dark silhouette against an even darker background. Too far away to identify, too indistinct to determine whether it was a man or a woman. Investigators initially dismissed it. Coastal rocks often create strange shadows beneath moonlight. Human eyes have a remarkable tendency to see faces and figures where none exist. But when independent imaging analysts examined the photograph, they reached the same conclusion. It wasn't a shadow. Someone had been standing there, watching the ocean, switched on the porch light, or perhaps watching the cottage. Emily remained inside for the next several hours. She never ordered room service. She never contacted the front desk. She never made another phone call. Phone records showed only a brief text conversation with her younger sister shortly before 10 o'clock. Her sister asked the question families often ask when someone begins a vacation. "How's the place?" Emily replied almost immediately, "You'll love it here." A few moments later, she sent one more message. "The lighthouse is even prettier than the photos." Her sister responded with a laughing emoji and reminded her not to spend the entire vacation behind a camera. Emily's answer was short. No promises. It was the last confirmed message she ever sent. The following morning, housekeeping noticed something unusual. Emily hadn't collected the breakfast basket left outside her door. At first, no one thought much of it. Many guests slept late after long drives. By noon, however, the basket remained untouched. The front desk attempted to call Cottage 7. No answer. They tried Emily's mobile phone. Rang. No one picked up. The receptionist assumed she'd gone hiking. By evening, there was still no sign of her. The breakfast basket sat exactly where it had been placed hours earlier. Fresh fruit had begun to spoil beneath the afternoon sun. The coffee inside the insulated flask had gone cold. It was then that the resort manager decided to unlock the door. Cottage 7 looked almost exactly as Emily had left it. Her suitcase rested beside the bed. Most of her clothes were still neatly folded. Her passport lay inside the bedside drawer. Her wallet remained on the kitchen counter. Nothing appeared to be missing. Nothing had been overturned. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken furniture. No shattered windows. No blood. The bed had been slept in. The bathroom towel was damp from a recent shower. A half-finished mystery novel rested face down on the arm of the sofa. It looked less like the scene of a disappearance, and more like someone who expected to return within minutes. The only item investigators could not find was the camera Emily had carried throughout town the previous day. Local police arrived shortly after 6 that evening. Missing adults are not uncommon. Most are found within hours. Some become disoriented. Others simply choose not to tell anyone where they've gone. Detective Rachel Bennett had worked enough of these cases to know one thing. The first 24 hours mattered. She walked slowly through Cottage 7 without touching anything. Experience had taught her that houses often reveal more through routine than chaos. Everything looked ordinary. Almost unnervingly so. The refrigerator contained groceries Emily had purchased that afternoon. A loaf of bread, fresh fruit, yogurt, orange juice. Nothing suggested she'd been preparing to leave. On the dining table sat her travel notebook. Its first pages contained sketches of the harbor, the bookstore, and a list of places she planned to visit over the coming week. One page simply read, "Wake before sunrise. Lighthouse." Detective Bennett underlined the sentence in her notebook. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than an itinerary. Later, she would realize it was the first clue. Search teams were organized before nightfall. Volunteers combed nearby beaches carrying flashlights. The Coast Guard searched the shoreline by boat. Drones equipped with thermal cameras swept the surrounding forest. If Emily had slipped on the cliffs or become lost on a trail, they hoped to find her before sunrise. Morning came, then afternoon. Then another night. The search expanded farther inland. Still, nothing. No footprints, no backpack. No camera. No trace that Emily Carter had ever left Cottage 7 alive. It was as though she had simply stepped out of her own life and vanished. For Detective Bennett, that was precisely the problem. People don't disappear without leaving something behind. A mistake, a witness, something. She was convinced Emily had left one. The challenge was figuring out where everyone else had failed to look. By the third day, the investigation had attracted statewide attention. News helicopters circled the coastline. Reporters gathered outside the entrance to Seabrook Cottages. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns to help search the beaches, wooded trails, and abandoned service roads that stretched for miles beyond the lighthouse. The public quickly divided into two theories. Some believed Emily had suffered an accident somewhere along the cliffs. Others believed she had staged her own disappearance. Detective Bennett believed neither. Emily had left behind too much. People planning to disappear rarely leave their passport. They don't abandon their wallet. They don't leave cash on the kitchen counter. And they certainly don't leave behind a career they'd spent years building with a promotion only weeks away. Nothing about Emily's life suggested she wanted to disappear. Everything suggested she intended to come home. Investigators began reconstructing her final day minute by minute. The grocery store provided surveillance footage showing Emily laughing with a cashier after accidentally dropping a bag of coffee beans. The bookstore owner remembered recommending a collection of local ghost stories after Emily admitted she always bought one book written by an author from every place she visited. She never bought it. Instead, she smiled and said, "I'll grab it before I leave town." She never got the chance. At the harbor, an elderly painter remembered Emily asking the same question she'd asked almost everyone she'd met. If someone only had one morning in Ashmore Cove, where would you tell them to go? Without hesitation, he pointed north. The lighthouse. By the end of the week, detectives realized something that hadn't been obvious before. Nearly every conversation Emily had that afternoon somehow led back to the lighthouse. Not because she was obsessed with it, because everyone recommended it. The lighthouse had become part of her plan long before she disappeared. Then the investigation took its first unexpected turn. Digital forensic analysts finished examining Emily's camera memory card. At first, detectives believed they already had every photograph she'd taken. They were wrong. Modern cameras automatically save hidden information with every image. Time, exposure settings, lens orientation, even tiny movements made while the camera is switched on. One analyst noticed something unusual. Emily's final recovered photograph had been taken at exactly 9:34 p.m. But according to the camera's internal motion sensors, she had been standing almost perfectly still for nearly 3 minutes before pressing the shutter. She wasn't walking. She wasn't adjusting her lens. She wasn't searching for a better angle. She was simply looking. The camera remained pointed toward the shoreline the entire time. Detective Bennett stared at the report. 3 minutes is a long time to look at one spot, especially for someone who had spent the entire afternoon constantly moving from one photograph to the next. Something had held Emily's attention. The enlarged image suggested that something might have been the figure standing on the rocks. The photograph was sent to a private forensic imaging laboratory. Specialists enhanced every pixel, adjusted light levels, separated reflections from solid objects. When the report came back, it confirmed what investigators had quietly begun to suspect. The silhouette wasn't caused by shadows. There had been a person standing near the water. The analysts couldn't determine who. They couldn't estimate age, or even gender. But they were confident about one thing: the figure was real. That finding changed the entire investigation. Detectives now had a potential witness or a suspect. The problem was they had no idea which. Every resort guest was interviewed again. So were local fishermen, hikers, photographers, and residents who lived along the coast. No one admitted standing on the rocks that night. No one reported seeing another person near Cottage 7. It was as though the figure existed only inside Emily's photograph. Meanwhile, another team focused on Emily herself. Friends described her as careful. She always texted someone when she reached a new destination. She kept printed copies of hotel reservations even though everything was saved on her phone. She planned trips weeks in advance and rarely changed her itinerary. Her younger sister laughed while speaking to detectives. Emily once drove nearly 3 hours back to a cabin because she'd forgotten her favorite camera lens. The detective smiled. 3 hours? She said the trip wouldn't feel complete without it. That single story eliminated another popular theory. Emily wouldn't willingly abandon the camera she'd carried everywhere. If it was missing for a reason. A week into the investigation, Detective Bennett returned to Cottage 7 alone to go through the security camera recordings again. The working theory transformed the investigation. Instead of asking whether Emily had crossed paths with a stranger, detectives began asking how many times it had happened. They returned to every location she had visited that afternoon: the grocery store, the harbor, the bookstore, the boardwalk, not to interview witnesses again, to study the surveillance footage one more time. This time they weren't looking for Emily. They were looking for the same tall figure. Hours passed with nothing. Then, just before midnight, one of the analysts called Detective Bennett into the review room. "I think you should see this." The footage came from a security camera mounted above a pharmacy 2 blocks from the harbor. Emily appeared exactly as expected, walking toward the waterfront with her camera hanging from her shoulder. She stopped briefly to photograph a fishing boat, then continued walking. The analyst slowed the video. There, for less than 2 seconds, a man crossed the street behind her. His face disappeared beneath the brim of a dark baseball cap. He never looked toward the camera. He never appeared close enough to alarm Emily. He simply crossed the street and vanished behind a delivery truck. The timestamp placed him there nearly 4 hours before Emily disappeared. Bennett compared the height, the build, the stride. It wasn't enough to make a positive identification, but it was enough to raise the same unsettling possibility. Emily hadn't encountered the stranger once, she had encountered them all day. As detectives continued reviewing footage, another detail emerged. The man never appeared to follow Emily directly. Instead, he always seemed to arrive before she did. When Emily stopped at the bookstore, he was already across the street. When she reached the harbor, he appeared in the background moments earlier. When she photographed the fishing boats, he crossed the road before she reached the dock. It was as though he already knew where she was going. That realization unsettled everyone working the case. Following someone is one thing. Anticipating their movements is another. Investigators requested every available mobile phone connection made within Ashmore Cove that day. Thousands of devices were identified and eliminated. Residents, vacationers, delivery drivers, and employees. Only one remained impossible to explain. The prepaid phone investigators had labeled device 14. It had connected to 3 different towers throughout the afternoon. One near the harbor, one close to the bookstore, and finally, the tower serving the lighthouse road shortly after midnight. Every significant location in Emily's timeline. The phone had moved almost exactly as she had. Then, it disappeared forever. For the first time since Emily vanished, Detective Bennett believed they weren't chasing a ghost. They were chasing someone careful. Someone who understood how to avoid cameras. Someone who left almost nothing behind. Almost. Years passed. The official search ended. The criminal investigation continued. Leads became less frequent. Public attention faded. News vans disappeared from Ashmore Cove. The story moved from front pages to anniversary articles. For Emily's family, nothing changed. Her bedroom remained untouched. Her mother refused to disconnect her mobile phone. Every birthday, her sister still mailed a postcard to the cottage. Not because she believed Emily would receive it, because giving up felt worse than hoping. Nearly 5 years after Emily disappeared, Detective Bennett received an unexpected package. There was no return address. Inside was a plain white envelope, a single memory card, and one typed sentence: "You missed one photograph." The package was immediately sent to the forensic laboratory. The memory card contained only one image. No metadata, no camera information, nothing identifying when or where it had been taken. The photograph showed the lighthouse trail in the pale light before dawn. The quality was poor. The image was grainy. At first, it appeared empty. Then analysts enlarged the center of the frame. Emily stood facing away from the camera. She was unmistakable. The same blue windbreaker, the same shoulder-length hair, the same camera strap hanging at her side. She appeared completely alone, until investigators looked farther into the trees. Half concealed behind a pine, someone was watching her. Only part of their body was visible: a shoulder, an arm, and the edge of a dark jacket. It was impossible to identify the face. But one detail stood out immediately. They weren't hiding from Emily. They were hiding from whoever had taken the photograph. That changed everything, because it meant there had been a third person. Someone behind the camera. Someone who had witnessed the encounter and never come forward. Detective Bennett placed the photograph beside the earlier lighthouse image. For years, she believed the case involved two people: Emily and the unidentified stranger. Now there were three. One of them had vanished. One had never been identified. And one had been standing quietly behind the lens all along. The investigation wasn't over. It had simply become even more impossible. And somewhere beyond the cliffs of Ashmore Cove, the truth remained just out of reach. The anonymous photograph dominated the investigation for the next several weeks. Detectives treated it as both a potential breakthrough and a potential trap. There was no envelope barcode, no usable fingerprints. The memory card had been wiped so thoroughly that forensic specialists couldn't recover a single deleted file. Whoever mailed it understood enough about digital evidence to remove nearly everything investigators might have used to identify them. Almost everything. One detail remained. The image had been compressed using editing software released only 8 months before Emily disappeared. That meant the photograph hadn't come directly from a camera. Someone had opened it, viewed it, edited it, then exported it again. It was a small detail, but it proved something important. The anonymous sender hadn't simply stumbled across the image. They had possessed it. For how long? No one could say. Detective Bennett refused to release the photograph to the public. If the sender contacted police again, she wanted information only they could know. Instead, she quietly expanded the investigation. Every professional photographer living within 200 miles of Ashmore Cove was interviewed. So were freelance journalists, wildlife photographers, and photography students who had visited the coast during the week Emily vanished. The interviews produced dozens of leads. Every one of them collapsed. Some had been out of state. Others produced original image files proving they had been elsewhere. Months passed. The mystery deepened. Then, just as the case began to grow cold, another witness came forward. His name was Samuel Grady, a retired lighthouse volunteer, 71 years old. He had ignored the news coverage because he believed what he'd seen wasn't important. Only after his granddaughter recognized him in an old newspaper photograph did she convince him to call investigators. Samuel met Detective Bennett at the station carrying a folded map of the coastline. "I don't know if this helps," he said, "but I remember the girl." Bennett leaned forward. "You spoke to her?" He nodded. The afternoon she arrived. According to Samuel, Emily had stopped him outside the Lighthouse Visitor Center. Not to ask about ghost stories. Not about local legends. She wanted directions. Specifically, she asked whether the old maintenance trail beyond the lighthouse was still open. Samuel told her it wasn't. The path had been closed years earlier after coastal erosion made sections unstable. Emily thanked him, then asked one final question. "Does anyone still use it?" Samuel remembered laughing. "Only people who don't know it's closed." At the time he thought nothing of the exchange. Now, it seemed far more significant, because investigators already knew Emily had eventually gone beyond the lighthouse, toward the abandoned trail, exactly where she'd been advised not to go. Detective Bennett spread a detailed topographic map across the conference table. The abandoned trail wound north along the cliffs before disappearing into dense woodland. Very few tourists ever walked that far. There were no scenic overlooks. No marked viewpoints. Nothing worth seeing. Unless you'd been told to go there. The thought lingered. Had someone arranged to meet Emily beyond the lighthouse? Or had curiosity simply carried her farther than she intended? There was no evidence to answer either question. Only possibilities. The following week brought another surprise. A forensic accountant reviewing Emily's bank records noticed a transaction investigators had overlooked during the first days of the case. It wasn't unusual because of the amount. It was unusual because of where it happened. At 8:41 p.m., minutes after leaving Harbor Lights restaurant, Emily purchased a bottle of water from a vending machine near the public parking lot. The machine was equipped with a small security camera designed to discourage vandalism. Police requested the footage. Against all odds, it still existed. The camera quality was poor. The angle was awkward. Emily approached the machine, inserted her card, and waited. She collected the bottle. Then something caught her attention. She turned. Not suddenly. Not in fear. More like someone hearing their name. She looked beyond the edge of the frame for several seconds. Then, she smiled politely. The kind of smile people give strangers. Or acquaintances. Not close friends. Not people they're afraid of. She gave a small nod. Said something too faint for the microphone to capture. Then walked calmly back toward her car. Detectives replayed the footage repeatedly. Who had she spoken to? No one entered the frame. No reflection appeared in the machine. Nothing. Only Emily. Acknowledging someone the camera could not see. For Detective Bennett, the video solved one question. Emily wasn't being chased. She wasn't running. She wasn't trying to escape anyone. By every visible measure, she believed she was safe. That realization made the case infinitely more disturbing. Because whatever happened later that night began with trust. Years have passed since Emily Carter arrived in Ashmore Cove carrying a suitcase, a camera, and a notebook she hoped to fill with memories. The notebook was recovered. Her suitcase was recovered. Even the books she planned to read were found exactly where she left them. But Emily herself was never found. To this day, investigators cannot explain the unidentified figure seen watching her from across the street. They cannot identify the prepaid phone that mirrored her movements through town. They cannot explain who stood beside her near the lighthouse. Or who stood behind the camera that captured the final anonymous photograph. Perhaps those questions are connected. Perhaps they aren't. The truth may be far simpler than anyone imagines or far stranger. But one fact has never changed. Emily Carter arrived in Ashmore Cove expecting to spend 5 quiet days by the sea. Somewhere between Cottage 7 and the old lighthouse. Her story ended. No one knows exactly where. No one knows exactly why. And somewhere along that forgotten stretch of coastline the answer may still be waiting. For someone who finally notices what everyone else missed.